It seems like a lot of people have some questions about the Packers cap situation, and in fairness, it is confusing. People often bring up actual cap space when cap space itself is kind of irrelevant. It's more of an accounting tool than it is an actual hard line as to what you can or cannot spend. The real thing to look at when wondering how much money a team has is always going to be just how much money they actually spend. That's a much better predictor to figure out how much money they will spend in the future. So before the Davante Adams trade, this is where Green Bay was at. They had $216 million that they were actively spending. And again, that's the key thing to note. The salary cap is $208 million. So their cash to cap ratio is 1.1, which you might be sitting here and saying, wait a second, that seems like very high. And also like, how does that even work? You can spend over the salary cap? And the answer is, well, yeah, teams spend over the salary cap almost all the time. I mean, typically there's going to be around 20 to 30 teams that spend over the salary cap. Last year, 30 teams spent over the salary cap in terms of actual active cash spending. So then can the Green Bay Packers just continue to spend as much as they want to? Well, no. And the Davante Adams move was in part a money move because there's other key things at play here. For one, they now have to spend about $17.7 million to pay their draft picks. That's because they have extra draft picks now. That will not be the cap hit immediately. The cap hit will be a little bit lower, but again, it's less about cap hits and more about actual cash spent. This is why you're able to see teams like Tampa Bay and like the Rams continue to add free agents, even though it seems like they're up against the cap, because it's more about actual cash than it is about salary cap space. So now going over to this chart, this is an important chart to look at here. So what we're looking at here is this is year by year, how much millions of dollars did the Green Bay Packers spend over the salary cap in the past. Looking at their past years, we can kind of use that to determine how much they'll probably spend over the cap this year. So last year they only spent $2 million over the salary cap, but they also have spent on several different occasions $28 and $29 million over the cap respectively, also $13 and $11 million. This is right around normal range for an NFL team. This is about what the average NFL team would look like if you go back 5 years and see how much they've spent over the salary cap. This means that the range of 5 years, it goes from, the least amount they spent was $2 million over the salary cap. The most amount they spent was $29 million over the salary cap. The average and what we can probably expect that they'll spend over the salary cap would be somewhere around 16.6, but that's kind of the range. They could end up spending up to only a couple million over the cap. They could end up spending up to around $30 million over the cap. That's what we should expect at least. It could even be different than that. I know it's a big range. We want to have an exact number, but that's just not how it works in football. Now, it is probably worth mentioning, I would assume that Green Bay does have an actual number. I'm assuming that the front office does have okay, we're only going to be able to spend $16 million over the salary cap this year. So, they make the plan based on that. That's typically how that works, but that information is not public. So us as fans, we have no idea how much Green Bay is going to actually be willing to spend. So this chart is the best way to figure out around how much that they could still spend. This is going to be kind of a math question. And also what I'm going to do here is I'm going to round to the nearest million. Just makes it easier that way. So the budget that they have is $210 to $237 million total. That's including what the salary cap is, $208 million, plus how much they typically go over, or at least have gone over in the past. That's about what we should expect from them this following year. You could think, well, hey, they're competitive, so won't they likely spend more money just because they try to win a championship? Well, they didn't do that last year, so maybe that was just weird because of the pandemic. They didn't know if they had enough money. I don't know, but it's not a given that they'll spend more than they do on an average year simply because they're competitive. So as of right now, after the Davante Adams trade, they have $196 million spent in actual cash. Now, about $18 million of that, again, a little bit less, but we're rounding, is going to be spent on draft picks, assuming that they pay all the draft picks, meaning that you add that all together, they have anywhere from 0 to 23 million left over to spend. Again, this does not mean that there is zero chance they could spend 30 million more, but realistically, this is probably what they're going to spend. Also worth noting, they do have over 53 players under contract, so it's not like they'll have to sign anyone just to fill out a roster unless they want to. So yeah, that's what I think about all this, and that's kind of, I think, a better way to personally just understand what they can do. They have more money that they can go out and sign free agents, but they can't get a ton of guys. You know, people have talked about why not go get Allen Robinson if you're going to make this move. If they did, they'd only have, I mean, for one thing, that might put them over their budget. It's actually totally possible they're already over their budget even after getting rid of Davante Adams. Maybe that's why they got rid of Davante Adams, is because the budget that they wanted to have was on the low end. Maybe it was $210 million in actual cash, which they were over and had to make a move. We just don't know. There's a whole financial aspect of this for these NFL teams, and that's why things can get so complex and sometimes confusing. And I think a lot of people, look at someone like the Rams and will say, wait a second, they just work the cap around all the time. The Saints were $100 million over the cap and barely had to lose anybody. How come the Saints can do that, but the Packers have to lose Davante Adams, at least in part because of a contract? I know there's a lot of, he wanted to play with the Raiders, all of that stuff, so it's a little bit more complex. But, they had to lose like Zadarius Smith for cap reasons, but it's not really cap reasons, it's money reasons. So that's, again, a great way to look at this is, if you Google actual cash spent NFL teams, it typically will come up. I know Over the Cap and Sports Track each have that readily available for the current year. They don't have it for previous years unless you pay, which I do because it's part of my job to know that stuff. But typically, you can kind of use as a rule of thumb, kind of around 10 to 15 million tends to be what most teams will spend over the cap. So that's what you want to look at, is total cash spending, not cap space. And so for the Packers, where do you go from here? Well, again, assuming that you do have that potentially 23 million more you could spend, 10 to 23 million more, you got to think that there's going to be more free agents coming. But again, a lot of people are saying, well, you have that 20 million in cap space now, you can go out and get a Davante Adams. I just don't know if they actually have 20 million to spend. They might, but they might not. And if they do, they probably don't have much more than that. That's kind of just the math of this situation. One more thing to note, as I'm kind of, doing two things, kind of explaining how the cap works a little bit while also talking about the Packers themselves. Just one more thing to note. Some people are going to bring up the fact that, well, Rodgers is getting a lot more this year, but then he's not going to get as much next year. Again, the cap hit and I guess there's three different figures. There's what the player is actually getting. That's what matters to the player. There's because that's what you want. What are you getting and what years are you getting it? The other thing is cap space, which is very different than what the player gets. And then the third thing is actual cash spent. That is also not necessarily completely tied into when the player gets their money. For example, if a player signed a 2-year, $20 million contract and they get $19 million the first year and $1 million the next year, basically, most teams still view that as like 10 million one year, 10 million the next. Their accounting tools will go that way because they know that next year they're still getting that player for 1 million, who is a quote unquote $10 million player. So it's still that's the way that they view it typically. So looking at it that way, that tends to be a good way to predict it, much more so than the actual. So when I say actual cash spent, just so you know what I mean by that, it is not necessarily actual cash spent, which is why things get even more confusing when you look at this. But yeah, hopefully that helped clear some stuff up. Hopefully you understand now a little bit more of just how this stuff works. And I think it's something that I learned about just making this video of like, okay, this is how much the Packers actually have. I'd love to do this for more teams, but there's so many different variables, because also like the draft picks, it costs different depending on how much draft capital you have. The Packers have more draft capital now, so all that stuff gets very complex. But basically, short answer, the Packers have anywhere from 0 to 23 million-ish to spend, around there. That seems to be what it could be. That's what I think of all of this. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.